everybody, Michael Dean here. I have this mirror video, which is a review of David Foster Wallace's review of Tracy Morgan's memoir. And I'm doing this because it is such a good example of showing, right? Writers often hear this adage of show, don't tell. So the showing is great here, but the telling is also really sophisticated. And I thought that through doing a deep dive and really analyzing it, we could really get to the core of this myth around showing and telling. And so I'll start off by showing you just like how I start deconstructing a piece. As I read what is basically a wall of text for 5,000 pages, I'll try and find the seams between different ideas, and then I try and name them and categorize them. And after I do that, I can start to assemble them and come to like bigger sections, right? And it's helped me to start to see essays as a series of questions and answers. So this whole essay can be seen as answering three specific questions. First, he gets into why do we yearn for sports memoirs to be great? Then the middle chunk, which is most of it, is why was Tracy Austin's memoir so remarkably bad? And it closes by asking the question, why might all sports memoirs be bad? So it's really a microcosm, right? Through studying one instance, we can understand the whole genre. And what is neat is you can take any of these questions and zoom in, and he's asking even more granular questions. So this memoir review is broken down into where did the ghostwriter mess up? Where was Tracy so naive? How could the memoir have been good? And what is the most shockingly bad part of it? So this covers just the general structure of the piece. But what I really wanted to get into was I wanted to understand how he was showing, right? Because his examples are so good. There are over 100 examples in this piece, which is a lot. That's like 2 examples every 100 words. And the most notable one, which Charlie mentioned in her memoir review, you should check that out, is this first page. And he starts, and we see him in the bookstore, like kind of embarrassed to buy this celebrity memoir. And what he does is he lists these 8 quotes back to back without explanation, right? So he is not telling you what he thinks about the memoir. He does that later. But to start off, he's just showing it to you and letting you come to your own conclusions. And this is really what Charlie Bleecker always talks about. It's not about telling us your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions. Just show us. And he starts off by doing this. And if you really look at how he's showing through the essay, there are so many different ways he shows, right? It's not just back-to-back stuff, but what stands out to me is how he has some very small examples, like just through a word or a reference. Then he has like medium examples that are a sentence, and then he has examples that are full-on stories that go for 2 paragraphs or so. And so there's a real rhythm to how he's switching up, how he shows you. So all the orange here is showing, but all the gray is telling. And that's kind of interesting because as amazing as this is at showing, right, these 2 lines are kind of showing. On the left are all the blocks where he's showing, and the right is where he's telling. And he's still doing the forbidden act of telling 45% of the essay. So there's something to it. There is a nuanced way in how you can actually tell your readers. And hopefully these diagrams help clarify that. On the left here is how David Foster Wallace is doing it. And on the right are how it's often done in a less successful way. So in this essay, what I learned, the thing that I want to remember, is this idea of structural telling and rhythmic showing. So structural telling, this means that what you tell really gives the whole scaffolding and the skeleton of your essay. So if you look at the gray here, he's often doing this. He starts by telling us, he's framing us what we're about to see, and then he shows us in lucid detail in a lot of different ways. But then he zooms back out of the scene and he summarizes it for us, right? So he has these bookends, and inside of it is this like immersive visual juice that really makes the essay come alive, but it's framed in these very boring matter-of-fact descriptions sometimes. He's also telling to pivot from one example set to the next example set. And so this shows that telling has two jobs. One is it helps us understand what you're showing us, but more importantly, it helps connect all these different blocks, right? So like through telling, you're actually carving the whole path through the essay. And if you just look at this stack, look at the orange that's inside of each frame. It's different each time. And this is why I think I feel reader trance when I'm going through this essay, right? It's always evolving, right? You're hooked in. The first example, you have 3 small examples, and then a medium one, and then a big quote. In the middle, it's just 5 back-to-back questions that are all equal. And in this bottom one, it's an immersive story, right? So he's very rarely using the same showing formula. It's not a formula, but it's like a, what is it? It's like a scaffolding. He's rarely using the same shape twice in a row, and that makes it come alive. And compare that to these 3 diagrams, right? The one on the left is very drone-like, where you're doing show and tell, show and tell. Hey, they're both equal in length, but if you're always kind of showing an example that is structured identically to the one before, you start to get bored. It's similar to when writers will have back-to-back sentences of the same length over and over and over. You just kind of tune out. This middle one, all telling, right? That is when you just exist in the realm of like theory, and you're not using sensory details, and chances are the reader is either bored or confused. And on the right, if you're only showing, which can actually work sometimes, it's harder to pull off, but you can do it. If you're only showing, it's likely to be extremely lucid, but the reader might be wondering, what's the point? And so little insertions of telling can help the reader get that. So this is the pattern we really want to study, and the goal here now is to see that play out in this essay. So this is a visual outline, excuse me. This is a visual outline of the essay, How Tracy Austin Broke My Heart. Again, he's reviewing her memoir, Beyond Center Court. And so there's a little visual notation here. So 3 things to know. One of them is that these gray lines that you see that are flat, this is where he's telling. This is where he's basically setting us up for what he's going to show or pivoting to the next thing. The colors matter too. So the green is when he's referencing the memoir directly, whereas the blue, the light blue, is where he is referencing other things like different athletes, different sports, philosophers. He's drawing upon his cultural knowledge. Whereas the purple, there's 3 blocks in there. These are his stories that come from his life. It's the kind of research that only he has access to. And they're at the beginning and the end. And the other thing is look at the size of the blocks as we go through this, right? Because they're to scale, right? All of these blocks are to scale of how they're featured in the essay. So if you see a very thin block, that means it's referenced as a word. And if you see a very long block, that means it might go on for 2 or 3 paragraphs. So let's get into it. You can see in this first section, right, he has these bookends, right? He is opening with the story of like, hey, I'm kind of embarrassed to buy the celebrity memoir. But then he closes and he goes back to him as this 18-year-old kid, just obsessed with her on TV, totally envious of her and wondering how she is so brilliant at tennis. So he has these bookends. It makes it really personal. We already talked about those back-to-back quotes. But then look at these blue blocks. I think there's something really special happening. First off, there's a lot of different ways that he's showing. He starts with a comparison between plumbers and accountants and how you can't quantify what makes someone good there, but you can quantify an amazing free throw shooter, right? Then he gets into references. He's mentioning Michael Jordan, Pete Sampras. He uses a metaphor, right? He says an angel-animal hybrid. That's what an excellent athlete is. That's what makes them televisable. So you can see he's doing different tools. He's doing comparisons, references, metaphors. What I thought was cool here is he has this kind of word cloud. So he's saying, hey, we want to know the stories of these great athletes. And in their stories, we want to know their humble roots, their privation, their precocity, their grim resolve. He uses these 11 words, and it's a very micro style of showing through using very specific words, right? He He has 11 words, one sentence back to back. Then, immediately after that, he has 11 questions where he's asking very specifically the kind of curiosities that fans have. Like, what does Pete Sampras do in his off time? Or what exactly was going through your mind before you won that point? He asks 11 extremely specific questions. And then after that, though, he then immediately shows his story of him and his envy and how he's obsessed with Tracy and trying to figure her out. And if you just visually read this left to right, what's happening is it's a decrescendo, right? He's starting extremely small and tight, and then he has more breathing room, and each example goes from a word to a sentence, and then boom, now you're just kind of immersed in his looser story. So it's kind of a very natural move that he's doing throughout the essay. He's decrescendoing, and he's also crescendoing sometimes, where he goes from really big, spacious examples to really tight back-to-back ones. So you can see how this, just visually, right, how this structure is like neatly tied together, and how it's also very different from this middle core of the book, which is really the memoir review. And if you kind of just read the ABCD, right, if you read the outline, you understand his whole argument. He's asking, where did the ghostwriter mess up? And he answers, the prose was bad, the audience was off, like it doesn't know who it's written for, and the structure is just horribly cliche. Then he says, well, where was Tracy so naive? And he goes into the different ways that child stars are ignorant to the realities around excellence, right? She doesn't really have a grip on like the realities of hard work or friendship. She's not aware that bribery or match tanking is going on, and she's just naive to the drug culture around tennis. Then he asks, how could the memoir have been good? Because it was a classic Greek tragedy, but then in the end it was so shockingly bad because despite her crazy story, the words were pulseless, right? So he's like, little by little, I just told you that all at once, but little by little he's building that argument, and he's weaving in all of these examples in a very rhythmic way so we can see it and believe it. I'm not going to get into all of them because it'd be way too detailed, but I wanted to show just this one example, which is another kind of a decrescendo, but specifically, he's going from very general examples to an extremely specific one. So in this section, he says, the book doesn't know who it's written for. It's not for the fan. It is an Academy Award-style praise fest where Tracy is kind of just thanking everyone in her life. And he mentions 5 figures, right? Parents, siblings, coaches, trainers, and agents. But then he mentions celebrities, and he talks about her kind of pandering to celebrities more than the other 5 groups. But then she zooms into celebrities, right? She picks one, Barbara Porter, who's her opponent at Wimbledon in 1980, and she shares a whole long quote, right? Longer than the whole setup, but it specifically shows the kind of pandering that she's doing. So that was section 2. Now looking at section 3, you can see the structure is different. It actually tells a little bit more than it shows in this section, but what's amazing to me is that this is where he tells us his thesis, right? His thesis is that these gifted athletes are so able to be in the zone and just be aware of the moment that they also don't really have the ability to process or articulate what's going on in their head. And that's actually the gift, right? The gift is this kind of mental lack of awareness paired with the physical ability, and you get the conditions for excellence. But he does have examples sprinkled in to show us, right? He breaks away from the memoir, and he's like, hey, this also happens in post-game interviews. And he just shows that footage where it's after the game, and after some spectacular win, it's just the most like cliche-filled 30-second statement. And then he starts to, bring us into his theory, and he's saying, that like, hey, let's think about like Kant or T.S. Eliot, right? These are amazing articulators, but they can't hit a curveball. They can't do anything that these athletes can do, and they're just two completely different skill sets. He finally comes back to Tracy and saying like, yeah, she was so great under pressure, and then compares that to himself. So this here is his 3rd and final story, and we see him on the tennis court in a high-stakes situation, and we see his inner chatter and how it's distracting him and it causes him to lose. And And so through his story, we get it, right? It's that someone who can be a great writer and can really be self-conscious and articulate and put it all into words and prose, that ability, that excellence in articulation will cripple someone even with the physical athletic talent. So it's great that he closes on the story. And again, the ending here, it's mostly telling with some metaphors and some quick examples mixed in. But the main one is the final Tracy Austin quote. This is her, the last time we see her in this essay, and it's the perfect quote. She's talking about her 1989 car crash, and she says, "I quickly accepted that there was nothing I could do about it," which is kind of crazy because he spends the whole essay talking about how it's extremely tragic, and any normal person like us, we would be scarred and traumatized if we became this child star by 21 and had our gift stripped away. He even uses the phrase like it's like dying but being forced to still be alive. It's really dramatic the way he frames this tragedy. And now she's like, I just accepted it, and she's into just speaking gigs and shopping now. And what he says right after this quote, right? So he shows the quote, and then he says, maybe this isn't just true, but it's exhaustively descriptive of her acceptance process. And he proves his point, right? That amazing and tragic stories about athletes often don't make great prose memoirs. And what he does is he has a whole orchestra of showing and telling to persuade us of this point. And sure, you can debate this point, you can argue it, you can show exceptions, but he really he makes it convincing, right? Because he was using this pattern. And this is really the takeaway. It's that it's not about not telling, it's not about only showing, it's about structural telling and rhythmic showing. Ultimately, you want to know how to tell in a very lucid and varied way, but you just want to have the bare minimum insertions of telling to both frame what you're showing us and to connect scene to scene. So I hope that's helpful. I hope you see that play out in your own drafting moving forward. I know it's definitely helped one of my latest essays, and yeah, I'd love to hear what comes to mind after you see this. Thanks a lot for watching.